So today's a big one. No, like literally a big one. The Cornwall IVs are huge box speakers. And let's face it, they are kind of ugly. They kind of look like a refrigerator. And a very expensive refrigerator at that. These are 6,000 US a pair. So what can this $6,000 gigantic box possibly offer that no other speaker can? That's what we're talking about today. So make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell notification so that you don't miss anything. And let's get straight to it. So the Cornwalls, first of all, is part of the Klipsch heritage line, which means that these are not like the speakers that you see in a lot of the home theaters, the reference series and so on, the RP600M that was very well known through many YouTube reviews. It's not exactly on that page. This is a different series, and this really comes from a history. And the way I like to look at the heritage series is literally you're owning a pair of speakers that has a lot to do with the American history. First of all, these are the fourth generation. So there was the Cornwall I, Cornwall II, Cornwall III, and the Cornwall IV here. I've owned the Cornwall I and II. I've heard the Cornwall III while working at the high-end retail store. And I feel like it just got a little bit more attractive with the Cornwall IVs in terms of aesthetics, because the Cornwall I and II and even the III were ugly as. So these are 102 dB efficient, and I am not going to bore you with all the specs. I'll just throw it up right here. And as you can see, these are horn-loaded tweeters, horn-loaded mid-range, and a 15-inch paper fiber woofer with 3 ports in the front. That's actually horn-loaded ports. So before, the Cornwall I and II, and even the III, I believe, didn't have this horn-loaded port. And the idea behind this is that this design, this kind of shape, allows the air to move in and out of the cabinet with more ease, allowing the speaker to move much more air. And we'll get to that in a minute. But a change you also notice is that the mid-range horn now is a different shape inside than the older Cornwalls. Those were kind of rectangular. Now we see a much more curved in kind of look on the horns. And this plays with the aesthetics. I think I like it better like this than a rectangular horn. And of course, it's not just for aesthetics. It has to do with the sound as well. It allows the speakers to have a wider dispersion pattern, allows the speakers to have a smoother response, etc., etc. And really to help with a little bit of the aesthetic, they have the grill as well that's magnetically attached to the speaker, which I quite like. The grill is a nice touch. It feels quality. The finish I have here is actually gorgeous looking. It is a American walnut. And they have other finishes as well, but this is perhaps one of my favorite finishes on the Cornwall speakers in general, in the heritage line, let's say. So these are efficient, large speakers. And there's two things that we have to go over before we actually talk about the sound, is that the sound actually changes dramatically. This has to do with the sound, I guess. It changes dramatically depending on the placement of the speakers. A typical horn-loaded speaker that you would expect, for example, like the Klipsch RP600M, has this brighter characteristic on the top end with lots of air, and it's now great for rock and roll, etc., etc. You don't quite get that with the Cornwall IVs unless you tow them in directly towards you. When you tow them in directly towards you, you get that kind of experience with these speakers. You get that kind of a little bit brilliant top end with sparkle and kind of rock and roll sound. But when you have them towed out into your room, and don't get me wrong here, it doesn't have to be entirely towed out. It could be just a little bit away from your ear. Now it becomes, I would say, even a little bit rolled off on the top end. It becomes smooth. And so playing with a toe in to get that right balance for your ear is critical with these speakers. And I cannot emphasize this enough. This speaker is really sensitive to that, and it can ruin or make the experience with these speakers. Now, another thing that you have to understand is that I thought my space would be way too small for these speakers. And I was quite worried when I first unboxed them because I did not expect them to be so gigantic in my space, because I used to work in a bigger retail store, so they looked relatively smaller there. But quite surprisingly, they work fabulously in a smaller space. Now, of course, in a bigger space, I am sure they can perform better, and I can already see that with the speakers. The room is the limiting factor with these speakers right now. And it seems to be not just me. I've talked to other reviewers, and I've seen other reviewers like, The Audiophiliac and Zero Fidelity use them in a smaller-ish room, and they found that it works quite tremendously well. So these speakers are really not necessarily for large spaces. Granted, they would look much better and sound much better in larger spaces. So most of what I will talk about in this review will be, of course, based off of my placement. Now, I had them not entirely directly towards my ears, but just slightly off. And I had them fairly far away from the wall. I would say like 7-8 feet from the back wall. And not ideal at all, but I pushed the speakers to the side walls as close as possible so that I get a wider space in between the speakers. So that's what my review is based off of. Not ideal at all. But given that I've owned the Cornwall 1s and 2s and I heard the 3s, and they were in a much better environment than these were, these actually really impressed me even in this space. And there's no doubt this is the better Cornwall in all honesty. These are the Cornwalls as of now, unless they come up with the Cornwall 5s. But these speakers are not for everyone. It is for a certain type of listener. And so if detail is important to you, like every little bit of detail, then although the Cornwall 4s are, I would say, debatably better than the 3s or 2s and 1s in terms of detail retrieval, it is still not going to beat speakers like Magical, Focal, B&W, and so on in terms of detail retrieval and being able to hear all those nuances. Imaging. If you're expecting to hear pinpoint imaging, like being able to draw the listener or the instrument in exact places, then it's not going to do that as well in comparison to something like Focal, B&W, and stuff like that as well. So if those two things are important to you, then this speaker is probably not the speakers for you. But if you're someone who likes a wide soundstage, I'm talking about stretching out of the room, no problem, with a smooth mid-range that draws you into the music emotionally, well, at least for me, then these speakers are certainly it in terms of that kind of regard. It is such a very, very emotional 3D holographic type of sound that these speakers give out. And there's no doubt about it. If you go from these speakers to any other floor standard or bookshelf speaker, you immediately notice the difference in the soundstage, the width, the depth. These speakers are incredible in terms of sound staging. There is no doubt about that. It's as if you're listening to a large stadium. Now, the high frequency, like I said, can be really catered towards your liking. Now, the thing I like about these speakers is that whether you have them towed out or towed in, the sound staging doesn't change all that drastically. You still get that beautiful sound staging. And one of the placement that I tried that I really, really liked was having these speakers heavily towed in. Now, these don't look good heavily towed in at all, but for the sake of sound, I was willing to try it out. And this was perhaps one of my favorite kind of quirky kind of placement. It gave me like a 3D dimensional, like I got stuff hearing from the back, and that was a really fun experience. And you have to really hear it for yourself to experience this, but this is like a 3D holographic soundstage that you get. You hear stuff from the back, and it's almost like you're hearing a surround system, but you're not. And surprisingly, in terms of the high frequency, this is perhaps the most refined high frequency I've heard from Klipsch speakers. I've heard many Klipsch speakers, but this is perhaps the most smooth, refined high frequency that I've heard in their lineup. And this may be because I had a longer listening session with these speakers, being able to match with the different amplifiers and so on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the high frequency is surprisingly refined. Now, when it comes to the bass is actually very impressive. Now, remember how I told you in the beginning of the video of the port design being able to move more air? And you get that with these speakers. And that is one of the most biggest reason I think that they go with this big ass box design, because it's able to move so much air. And it's not just about the bass quantity. Now, these do have a lot of bass, but at least in this space, but it's not about the amount of bass. It's just about the air it's able to move. You just don't get that with a lot of the speakers. It's just physically strained because you can't move that much air. It's just physically impossible. And this is especially true with Magnepan speakers, like planar magnetic designs. You can't physically move a lot of air. Well, these speakers are made for that. So it gives you this huge impact and presence in the bass that is just not the same as listening to a very good pair of bookshelf speakers with really good bass response that dips down to 20 hertz. It's not the same. Those may go down lower on the graph, but these makes you feel, and that presence is just entirely different. And the first thing that everyone in the studio, when we first heard these, said in consensus was, scratch the fact if they liked it or not. Everyone agreed. The bass is tight and controlled. Very surprisingly, very, very controlled. For a 15-inch woofer, it was quick, fast, not like magical or focal, but, fast enough. And it was just very palatable. It was impactful. It was grunting, but not in a way that is losing control. It was just able to go down without a problem and without any type of chuffing or port noises. Now, usually I play this track called Bass I Love You and take my B-roll shots to show the woofers moving. And this track really makes any woofer move. And that was my belief until these speakers. The woofers don't actually move a lot. And this was very intentional by Klipsch. In their own words, if it moves, it distorts. So what you end up getting because of this stiff design is a sound that is very controlled, very tight, very extended, and of course with all that air that you feel in your chest, and the bass is fantastic. Now, another thing that I kind of liked about the speaker is the tonal balance. Now, some would argue that the tonal balance is not all that accurate, and you're absolutely correct. It is colored. It is colored. But it is not so colored in a way that it makes you feel uncomfortable or feel like you're listening to a trumpet when you're listening to a saxophone. Rather, it gives you kind of that effect as to when you're listening to an instrument, it gives you like that kind of extended feel, if you know what I mean. So when you hear a violin, it gives you that kind of a little bit more stretched out feeling. And that to me is attractive because when I hear emotional music, one of the things is that kind of elastic feeling. That is what I look for in my music. Now, I said the imaging is not so great on these speakers, and they're not in comparison to something like Vocal, Magical, or a very quality, bookshelf speakers, especially in this price range. But the imaging is surprisingly not bad at all on the Cornwall IVs. They're really not. Especially in comparison to the Cornwall IIIs that I've heard and the 1s and 2s that I've owned. These are in fact the best in terms of imaging. But again, it's not that reason that you get these speakers, because if imaging is the most single important factor for you, then you probably shouldn't consider these speakers, because these speakers don't exactly image, pinpoint, but they kind of throw a sound stage, a sound field, I should say, in front of you, a wall of sound that engulfs you into the music. And that's what these speakers are about. It's not about being able to pinpoint each individual elements in the music and all that stuff. Now, like I said, they are very sensitive speakers. These can be driven with tube amplifier single-ended, and they will sound amazing. But I've tried 3 different amplifiers in my space. I tried it with the Wilsonton R8 that I reviewed, of course, and that was a fantastic combination with these speakers. Give that a little bit of spark on the top end, that tube magic, the mid-range, again, very good tonal balance there. The bass was very authoritative, very punchy, very dynamic, and really helped the speakers out. Really good synergy there. I also tried the bigger brother, which is the one with the 805 tubes, and these are very heavy, 100 pounds, and chunky, a little bit more expensive, and these gave a little bit more of that warm characteristic. I would say it wasn't my entire favorite match to go with the speakers, but it certainly gave the widest sound staging, and it also gave you that really smooth liquid sound, if that's your thing. Now, my favorite pairing, however, would be, ironically, the smallest of the bunch, the Leak Audio Integrated Amplifier. Now, when I hooked these up, I was so very surprised because this actually gave the biggest sound. The bass was very, very authoritative, very good grunt, just incredible impact air movement, incredible mid-range tonal balance, high frequency were just amazing. Now, in fact, this has tone control, so I could actually have the speakers toned out more for that a little bit more wider soundscape if I wanted to, and actually play around with the tone control, the treble control, to actually adjust the high frequency to my liking. I turned up the treble just a bit on the tone control, and that gave me a perfect balance, and I could have the speakers, toned out into the room for that, more flexible placement of the speakers, if you so will, and I got that perfect balance. So the Leak Audio is a clear winner for me in terms of what I've tried with this speaker, and I was very, very impressed by it. But of course, every speaker has its caveats, so let's go with the most basic one. It's big, it's gigantic, it's intrusive, and it looks like a refrigerator. Very nice one, but still a refrigerator type of size, a laundry machine or something. The other thing is that I think there could have been a little bit more attention paid to the components in the crossover. Now, I'm not saying the crossovers are absolute crap. It's actually pretty well built and made to what they can budget, most likely. And in all honesty, if it did make a huge difference, I think Klipsch would have kind of gave people that option, because it's money. That's literally money right there. Maybe that's something they should consider, because even if it's not a big improvement in sound, I would still go for the higher end crossover parts, just because it just gives me a peace of mind, pride that I have this quality chunky stuff in my crossover and whatnot. But that's about it for this video. I think that this speaker is fantastic. I have absolutely fallen in love with them, and if you get a chance, I definitely urge you to take a listen to them. And remember, before you draw any conclusions, have the speakers properly set up and tuned to your ears, because that's a big part with these speakers. So that's it from me. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe if this video was helpful to you, and also consider subscribing to our Patreon to keep us independent and keep these honest videos and reviews coming. Until next time.